Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Glatthaar.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I want to tell you that I am really impressed with the Delaware Historical Society, and you should be very proud of this institution. I also want to mention that Scott's brother Nick was one of my best friends in college. I'm surprised his brother's still alive. Actually, he's a judge. Isn't it funny? He went from crime to judging crime. He's a great guy, and he's not a criminal most of the time. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just delighted, and I'm also impressed that so many people turned out prior to the NFL draft, which is taking place today. I figured that would be a real damper, but then I learned that the draft doesn't happen until after the lecture. We called the NFL and asked them to postpone that. They readily agreed. What I want to do is talk about Lee and Grant, give you some background about the war, and I'm just going to follow them through the campaigns of 1864 and into 1865. I've got a picture up there of Robert E. Lee, which I dug out of the State Historical Society, Southern Historical Collection, at the University of North Carolina. It's a very unusual photograph of Lee, and I really liked it. I thought it was very telling. You see the sense of a worn-out man in that photograph. Now, I'll go back up to Grant. I want to put up the map of Maryland and Virginia for you to follow. In 1864, of course, the Army of Northern Virginia had suffered enormous casualties, fought tremendous battles, and had been exceedingly successful. But the success largely stemmed from the time Robert E. Lee took over as commander of the Army. Lee stepped in early June of 1862 with Union forces at the doorstep of Richmond. Lee launched skillful attacks, brought together forces, and drove them 20 miles back. And from that point on, Lee imposed his will on the Union commanders, regardless of who they were. He dictated the flow of actions in 1862 and 63. Of course, his army had suffered a pretty heavy setback, losing Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville, and of course the repulse at Gettysburg with lots of lives lost. But the army recovered very well from those things. Lee had taken up a position just south of the Rappahannock River, but he didn't have all his troops with him. If you look at the map there, you will see that Lee just isn't able to concentrate all his troops because of supply problems. What you've got is a situation in which logistics are dictating the way Lee can do things. The railroads have become decrepit as a result of overuse and runaway slaves, so no one's there to repair the rails, and of course it's very costly to produce new rails to replace the worn-out ones, and so that creates a big problem. Furthermore, Northern Virginia has largely been overrun. Farms are abandoned, troops have trampled the fields, areas are not under cultivation, so crop production has fallen tremendously. On top of that, you've got bad weather. They had serious weather problems in 1862. In 1864, you're going to have a drought, which is also going to affect crop production, and we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of that. Now, you can see from the map there roughly where Fredericksburg is, and here, there's a railroad that runs up to Fredericksburg, but it was designed largely for passengers. It's the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. So what you really have to do is take supplies off the railroad, the Virginia Central, and haul them by wagon up to Lee's army. That causes real problems. It's a good 20 miles up there, and That really exhausts the manpower and the animals. It's such a problem that Lee can't concentrate his entire army just south of the Rappahannock. So what he's got to do is leave Longstreet's Corps, James Longstreet's First Corps, about 20 miles away from the rest of the army, because it's on a railhead and at least they can get supplied there. So when the campaign begins, he's going to have to try and concentrate as rapidly as possible. Lee's got about 65,000 men in his army. He suffered heavy losses, and especially in the officer corps, it's been absolutely disastrous. Throughout the course of the war, if you were an officer in Lee's army, you have over a 50% chance of being killed or wounded at least once, I should say, not killed more than once. Killed or wounded once, more than once or more. So they suffer really horrible casualties. On the other hand, morale is tremendous. Why? Because they've been the single most successful institution in the Confederate States of America. No institution has achieved to the level of the Army of Northern Virginia. And of course, they have enormous faith in their commander, Robert E. Lee. Lee's seen them through battle after battle after battle, and they have every confidence that Lee will continue to do so. Of course, you know a little bit about Lee, I imagine. Graduated in the class of 1829 from U.S. Military Academy, second in his class. Interestingly, everyone makes a big deal out of the fact that Lee got no demerits, but he wasn't the only one in his class who got no demerits. There were other people in the 1829 class who got no demerits. Lee went into the engineers and was an accomplished officer. In the Mexican War, he was on Winfield Scott's staff and was truly extraordinary, so extraordinary that Winfield Scott wrote a letter to the Secretary of War stating that Robert E. Lee is the best officer in the United States Army. So Lee's reputation was enormous prior to the American Civil War. This 1864 campaign was going to be huge from the Confederate perspective. Why? Because they knew that 1864 was a presidential election year. And they believed that if they were able to punish the Union Army severely, as they had been doing throughout the course of the war, they had a good chance of making sure that Lincoln did not win re-election, maybe not even win the nomination, and that forces in the Union would seek peace. So they were very hopeful. As one Georgian wrote home, "This is to be the big fight, the fight that is to restore peace to our land or to be our everlasting ruin." Now our second commander, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, like Lee, was a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, class of 1843. Grant graduated 21 of 39, right in the middle. He was very good at mathematics, but it's interesting to see, if you look at Grant's library card, what you learn is Grant was reading classic literature during his time at West Point. Grant is an absolutely beautiful writer. In fact, when I have graduate students who don't write very well, I make them read Grant's memoirs, because Grant has a way of expressing himself so simply, so clearly, even when you're dealing with complex military issues. It's really a treat to read Grant's memoirs, and I strongly recommend you take that on. It's a great hobby. And of course, he's writing them while he's racing with the Grim Reaper. So Grant, of course, went into the regular army. He was quite the accomplished officer in the Mexican War, won 2 brevets, and performed some pretty spectacular feats. I should mention that at West Point, he set all sorts of high jump records on horseback. So in the Army's infinite wisdom, it put him in the infantry. Grant's probably the best combat soldier in the 19th century. So in the Army's infinite wisdom, it put him as quartermaster in his regiment. He, of course, abandoned his position and went into the fighting at Monterey and was a hero there, and then he served under Winfield Scott's army in the march to Mexico City and won accolades there as well. After the war, he got married, and then he was sent to California, where he missed his bride horribly. You have to keep in mind that these guys served really long periods of time apart from their family. He got very upset about that, and he started drinking, and eventually he resigned from the Army. Then he floundered around, and then eventually got into the war. And strangely enough, he offered his services to George B. McClellan to work on McClellan's staff. McClellan never wrote back. That's just one reason why McClellan is a zero. I'm only joking. He's not a zero. He's a negative. Anyway, Grant eventually became regimental commander. He got invited to help because he could do Army paperwork, and then he knew the drill, so he was able to drill the troops, the local regiment, and then they elected him as commander. So he ended up becoming a brigadier general, fought a battle at Belmont in November of 1861, overran a Confederate camp, and then his citizen soldiers started plundering, and they were then promptly overrun themselves. Grant made a great reputation in the Henry and Donelson campaign of February 1862. Bad weather and the approaching Union forces compelled the Confederates to abandon Fort Henry, but they concentrated at Fort Donelson, where Grant laid siege and eventually won the capture of the fort and about 14,000 prisoners of war. So Grant won the first truly significant victory for the Union Army. Shortly thereafter, he pushed on into southern Tennessee, where he fought the Battle of Shiloh. Grant's men were not caught off guard. They knew the Confederates were nearby, but they hadn't fortified, and the attack drove the Union troops back. The next day, reinforcements came. Grant launched a second attack and swept the field. You have to understand that Shiloh was the first monumental battle of the Civil War. As the war would go on, there would be numerous other battles that were much more bloody. But this was a shock for everyone. And of course, people began blaming Grant, claiming that he was drunk, which was not true, and that he was irresponsible and so on. And so all these accusations bumped around, and eventually Henry W. Halleck, nicknamed Old Brains, but sometimes brains and judgment don't work well in tandem. Halleck came in, took over the job, and Grant was put in second in charge, which meant he had really no responsibility. And Grant almost resigned his commission and left the Army. The person who saved him was William T. Sherman. Sherman went in and spoke to Grant and said, look, you know, my reputation was in the toilet when I went insane. Then I did really well at Shiloh, and I'm in fine feather. The only way you're going to restore your reputation is staying with the Army and seizing opportunities to demonstrate that you can contribute to this war effort. If you resign, you'll never get that back. And so he was able to stay, and of course, life worked out for Grant. Halleck eventually got recalled. Grant ultimately led what I consider the single most extraordinary campaign of the American Civil War, the Vicksburg campaign. There, Grant is not only fighting against large numbers of Confederates, but an exceedingly difficult terrain, and on top of that, a Mississippi River that's a mile wide. And what Grant eventually did was he feigned an attack from the northeast and shifted across the Mississippi River, marched his people along the western side of it, then shuttled them across the river and began a campaign from the south of Vicksburg, marching all the way to Jackson, Mississippi, and then pivoting and coming back. He fought numerous battles, won every single battle, was able to get more of his troops on the battlefield than the Confederates were able to do, and eventually drove the Confederates back into Vicksburg. Then he laid siege and ultimately captured Vicksburg and about 32,000 Confederates. So Grant won his second great victory. Interestingly, Lincoln had lost a lot of faith in Grant and sent a spy out, a guy named Dana, to poke around Grant's headquarters because he'd been getting letters from an old Illinois congressman named McClernand, who was arguing that Grant didn't know what he was doing and was incompetent and was drunk all the time. Well, Dana went out there and found out that, in fact, the only incompetent was McClernand, that Grant was perfectly sober, was resourceful, was creative, was thoughtful, and was on top of everything. And, of course, the campaign proved that to be true. So after the campaign, Lincoln wrote this letter to Grant, which I find pretty telling because it indicates the kind of relationship that they're going to build. And I think part of the reason that Lincoln wrote this is because Lincoln really didn't trust Grant. The Shiloh episode really scared the president, and the rumors that he had heard really scared the president. So he wrote, "I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service you have done the country." He then explained what his preference was, how to conduct the operations, and that he had little confidence in some of Grant's various schemes, quote, "except a general hope that you knew better than I." And then when Grant swung to the northeast after the capture of Grand Gulf, instead of reinforcing southward, Lincoln admitted, "I feared it was a mistake." And then he concluded with the words, "I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong." How many times have you ever heard that from a politician, let alone a president of the United States? Anyway, I think what Lincoln was doing was feeling a little guilt over the way he had treated Grant. And of course, Grant was now his man. When the disaster happened in Chickamauga over in Georgia, he brought Grant in to oversee the operations. In that instance, Grant's plans weren't all that successful, but ultimately the troops themselves made them successful, and of course that's the great advantage of being the boss. When everything works out great, you get the credit, and that was the case with Grant in the Chattanooga campaign. By that point, everyone in Washington wanted to know what Grant thought they should be doing next, and so the president, through Halleck, contacted him, and what Grant lobbied for was a campaign overland against Mobile, and they said, well, we can't do that now. He had originally lobbied for that after the fall of Vicksburg, and they said, we can't do that now. Then Grant said, well, how about we go to Mobile, and then we'll advance up towards Atlanta, and meanwhile, the other army will push south from Chattanooga area, and we'll seal them in a vice. And they rejected that one. Let's see. Oops, going the wrong direction. No, I'm not. Well, we're in trouble. Well, I'll go and do it manually. Yeah, the projector's not.
Oh, it's not moving?
Yeah, it's actually on the right one. Anyway, I'll just wing it. Anyway, Grant then proposed an ingenious concept. They wanted to know what he would do back east, and what he said was, I think what you should do is leave troops on the defensive and take a 60,000-man strike force and leave from roughly Suffolk, Virginia, southeastern Virginia, and march angling into North Carolina, destroying the Weldon Railroad, go down and seize Raleigh, and then swing around and come out either through New Bern or Wilmington and close Fort Fisher. And his argument was that North Carolina and those areas hadn't been struck, so there'd be plenty of food, we could feed the army, and if we destroy the railroad, Lee could no longer hold on to Richmond, which means that the Confederates would have to evacuate all of Virginia except a little portion of southwestern Virginia, and on top of that, they couldn't get the kind of war materials that they needed to continue fighting the war. So all those, I thought that was a brilliant concept. Halleck, of course, dismissed it out of hand, wouldn't even present it to the president, and said that the point wasn't the destruction of Richmond. Your target should be Lee's army. The problem is you have people like Halleck and Secretary of War Stanton and Abraham Lincoln, and I don't know everyone wants to put Lincoln on a pedestal and say he's a military genius, which he was not. They don't have any practical experience in field command. And Grant does. And Grant knows what troops can do and what they can't do. And he knew he could make this happen. And Halleck, with his limited experience in the field, simply didn't think he could do it. So anyway, the plan was rejected, but nonetheless, Grant's star was in the ascendancy. Lincoln realized that Grant had no real political ambitions, and so he then appointed Grant the Lieutenant General of the United States Army, the highest ranking position. When Grant sat down to come up with plans for the 1864 campaign, he realized that as commanding general, he needed to utilize all Union forces. The Union had overwhelming resources. What they needed to do was concentrate, utilize them all, stretch the Confederate defenses thin. And so that was his plan of attack. In Virginia, what would happen was, it was clear that Stanton, Lincoln, and Halleck wanted Grant to attack Lee's army. So they were going to have to do some heavy-duty fighting in Virginia. Grant would go after Lee's army. A command in the Shenandoah Valley under Franz Sigel would push through the Shenandoah Valley and clear that out, destroying the railroads and preventing that from serving the Confederate forces as a food depot. And then a third command was going to come towards Petersburg. And that was under Benjamin Butler, and if it seized Petersburg, that would sever critical rail connections up to Richmond. Lincoln, too, was fully aware of the upcoming presidential election, and he knew that time was running out. He had, in effect, hitched his wagon to Grant's horse. If Grant could achieve in 1864, Lincoln would likely win the presidency. If Grant did not succeed, it would prove to be a defeat at the polls. And the truth of the matter is, none of the domestic agenda really mattered. What really mattered was how well the war was going. If it looked like the Union was clearly going to win the war, then Lincoln probably would win re-election. But if it looked like the war wasn't going well, Lincoln would probably lose the election. And as I said before, those individuals really didn't understand Sherman's raiding strategy, but Sherman was going to conform his plans to meet their expectations, which is a pretty impressive feat on Sherman's part. Now Grant, which is a really impressive feat on Grant's part. Now Grant decided he was going to keep George G. Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade had good administrative experience, and he was from the Army of the Potomac. Grant was fearful that a Westerner coming in would really upset the troops and upset the officer corps, so he wanted to leave Meade in position. Furthermore, Meade knew the personnel. He knew who the best officers were, what the strengths and weaknesses of all the high commanders were, and that was information that Grant badly needed. The problem with Meade was his nickname was Old Snapping Turtle. He had one of those horrible qualities. He would shoot the messenger. You know, the people who bring bad news to you and you rip their head off even though they didn't do it. And, of course, the problem with that is no one wants to tell you bad news. So it impairs communication, and, of course, people became really resentful of Meade for that very quality. Grant decided he would travel with the Army of the Potomac, and he'd keep his headquarters tent right next to Meade's to make sure that the Union Army kept pushing. The problem with this, though, was it was a novel command structure, and it was a real problem. The highest-ranking officer in Washington, D.C. was Henry Halleck. Lincoln once referred to Halleck as a first-rate clerk. Now, that's not a very good compliment for the commanding general of the United States Army. What I'm suggesting is that Halleck doesn't make effective decisions, and he's really not comfortable in those positions. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz had emphasized, and Grant, of course, had never read Clausewitz, but the concept was clear, that the military establishment is part of the political sphere, and that war is policy by other means. Grant needed to be in Washington to advise the president and Stanton because they didn't know what was possible. And Halleck, of course, was not willing to give them the kind of important advice and accurate advice that they needed. So the biggest problem the administration had was that Lincoln was not going to get the kind of sound military advice that he really needed throughout the campaign. Well, the campaign began, and of course things didn't work out quite so well. Franz Siegel's command got routed by some Confederate troops and Virginia Military Institute cadets at New Market, and then fled ignominiously. And Benjamin Butler advanced and fought a battle at Drury's Bluff, and he was repulsed and fell back precipitously. Grant, meanwhile, crossed the Rappahannock River, and he was trying to slip through a dense area which was second-generation forest growth with tangled vines and thin trees and so on. It's called the wilderness. The problem with the wilderness is it's so difficult to move that you really can't get off the roads. And Lee knew this very well. That's where the Battle of Chancellorsville had partially been fought. And so Lee realized this was a great opportunity. So he attacked the Union forces in the wilderness. The reason was the Union had far more troops, but because of the terrain, it neutralized the Union manpower advantage. Furthermore, the Union had better artillery than the Confederacy, but you can't really deploy artillery very effectively in woods. So it was a brilliant idea on the part of Lee. On May 5th and 6th, they fought a brutal battle in the wilderness. And then Grant slipped by. What Grant was trying to do is rush through the wilderness and get northeast of that area so that in more open terrain where he could give battle to Lee. Even though he had taken that punishment, he pushed on and worked his way out. They then had a race to a place called Spotsylvania Courthouse. If Grant got there first, it would compel, well, that's the look. Here, there we go. We're back in action. Thank you. We need to go back. No. Forward, one more. There we go. See, there you see the wilderness, and you see the Confederates advancing. Longstreet way down in the lower part, Hill and Ewell up farther north. And then can we go to the next slide? And after the battle, you see the race down towards Spotsylvania. If the Union had gotten there first, Lee would have had to attack them behind fortifications. Lee's people barely beat them out, and so Grant again fought them. And at Spotsylvania, there's really nasty fighting going on. Can we go to the next one? Oops, next one. Yep, there's the fighting at Spotsylvania. Really nasty fighting, a couple of attacks with heavy casualties on both sides. Ultimately, the Confederates were repulsed. Now, after a few weeks in fighting, the toll was mounting dramatically on both sides, but the Confederates suffered worse. At the Wilderness, James Longstreet was shot through the throat by his own men. It was not intentional. And he was out of action for several months. In addition, Jeb Stuart was killed in action at a battle called Yellow Tavern, so the cavalry commander was killed. One of the corps commanders was wounded. Richard Stoddard Ewell had a nervous breakdown in the Spotsylvania battle, and he was then removed from positions of authority, and Jubal Early replaced him. But still, that's one more of your high command. And then Ambrose Powell Hill, the Third Corps commander, suffered from periodic bouts of prostatitis. Hill, as a West Point cadet, had committed some sexual indiscretions while he was passing through New York City, and he suffered those consequences. And the resulting prostatitis was a product of that moment of bliss. So three of his corps commanders and his cavalry commander are in bad shape. And so it's a pretty bad situation. The strain on Lee was enormous because while Early was a good backup corps commander, the one who replaced Longstreet was way out of his league. So Lee was commanding one corps, the cavalry, and the army simultaneously. Throughout the month of May, Lee never got more than 2 hours of sleep consecutively. Now, Lee is my age. And I'll tell you, I don't have to sleep that much, but boy, I need a little more than 2 hours consecutively for a month. think of the toll that took on his body. And of course, Lee had probably suffered a heart attack the previous year, which I, of course, have not. So you can imagine how bad that situation was for the Army commander. And the troops themselves were exhausted. The problem the Confederates have is they're fighting outnumbered. And as a result, they have to be in the trenches all the time. Otherwise, the Union's going to sweep around them. And these guys are getting under fire all the time. They're sleeping 2, 3, 4 hours a night. And that's fine for young men for a while. But after 3 or 4 weeks, they become completely exhausted. And so guys are literally falling asleep right in the middle of firefights because they're so exhausted. And the toll is just enormous on them. The Union, too, is suffering terribly during the course of this action. Grant's strategy, as I said, was to try and outflank the Federal troops. And if the Federals beat them to the punch, then he would grind them and kind of hold them. He didn't want them to slip away. He didn't want Lee to do one of his patented flank attacks. And so what he's trying to do is hold tight whenever he's in front of them. And as a result, the casualties were really high. Could you hit the next slide, please? There we see, in a not very clear way, go one more down, thanks. No, I'm sorry, we got to go one up. There we see the movement down farther to the south all the way to Petersburg. And what happens is Grant's trying to swing around the flank. Lee beats him to the punch. They fight at North Anna, then they fight at Cold Harbor. At Cold Harbor, some of you probably know, Grant's army loses 7,000 men. Some people say in 20 minutes, more likely within an hour. 7,000 people in an hour. That's a lot of folks. So it's a really difficult situation for the Union Army, and the casualties are just mounting stupendously. Fortunately, Abraham Lincoln has great faith in Grant. He doesn't really know what to do. He's not going to change his policies, but he has great faith in Grant. Grant does certain things when he comes into office that really impress Lincoln. For one thing, he gets the Secretary of War to issue orders that Union commanders are to, quote, to take proper measures to supply as far as may be possible the want of their troops in animals and provisions from the territory through which military operations are conducted, end quote. In other words, live off the Confederates. If you do so, you're depriving them of food. And that plus it's saving the government in logistics and saving the government in money. And Lincoln just loves that concept. He also loved the idea that he finally got a commander who got everyone moving simultaneously. Grant issued an order on the day the campaign was to begin. Not just his army, but all the armies. They were all to move on the same date. And you know, we're going to talk about this in a couple of minutes, but what happens is when guys like Grant and Sherman and another guy I'll talk about in a minute, Philip Sheridan, come into positions of authority, the complexion of the Union war effort changes. These guys have no tolerance for the dilettante leadership that the Union Army has endured. A lot of the guys in the Union Army, you know, a guy arrives 3 hours late and they give him a ticker tape parade. With Grant and Sheridan actually arrested a guy, a corps commander. The guy arrived 12 hours late. He arrested him and removed him from his position. These guys are no nonsense. When I tell you to be here by this time, you better be here unless you fought a battle on the way. I mean, these guys are really tough, really, really tough. But that's what it's going to take to win the war. So the relationship between the two has developed really well over the course of the war. And as the campaigns are unfolding, it's just working handsomely from the president's perspective. Across the Rapidan River, Grant plunged. They fought in the wilderness, and Lincoln wrote him how, in the aftermath of the wilderness, when Grant slipped around toward Spotsylvania, he said to one of his private secretaries, "How near we have been to this thing before and failed. I believe if any other general had been at the head of the army, it would have been on this side of the Rapidan. It is the dogged pertinacity of Grant that wins." That's a heck of a nice comment from the President of the United States, and spoken in confidence to his private secretary, who recorded it in his diary that night. So Grant continued to press Lee, but casualties mounted. Lee parried blow after blow. But each time that he blocked the Union advance, both sides were suffering really heavy losses. Furthermore, as you can see from this, Grant's moving to the southeast. What he starts doing is drawing reinforcements from way up north, from around Washington, and then he hopes to link with Butler's army because that's like getting a massive reinforcement. Grant's losing that many men. To give you an idea, in the first 5 weeks of the campaign, Grant's army lost almost 60,000 troops. And so he's drawing people from other areas. Furthermore, of course, Grant doesn't have much faith in Butler, so the sooner they link the two commands, the better off the troops in those commands are. Grant then pulled a really shrewd move. After Cold Harbor, he decided to swing way down and slip across the James River and come up at Petersburg. And what he hoped to do by seizing Petersburg, he would sever all sorts of railroads that were working their way up towards Richmond, and it would put a real burden on Richmond. The problem he had was that the troops, after all those losses, the Union troops were unwilling to attack fixed fortifications. So when they got to the position to carry Petersburg, and it was lightly defended by Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard, the troops wouldn't attack. And Beauregard actually pulled it off brilliantly, bluffed the Union and saved the place. Lee was completely confused. And so what ultimately happened was a siege ensued. And Lee knew a siege was a disaster. Lee had lost roughly 35,000 troops in the campaign to this point. He had picked up another 33,000. But from May to July of 1864, 102,000 Confederate soldiers checked into hospitals, military hospitals in Virginia. Now, Lee's doesn't have that many troops. Of course, some guys may have moved from one hospital to another, but even if everybody went into two different hospitals, that's 51,000 guys checking into hospitals. So you can see that Lee's army is suffering pretty staggering losses as well. And it's not just the killed and wounded, it's the strain of combat and the lack of satisfactory food, and it's just wearing them down. Ultimately, what Lee decided to do was detach Jubal Early's troops from his army and to move up into the Shenandoah Valley. What had happened was new commander David Hunter began moving south in the Shenandoah Valley, and Early went in there, merged with some Confederates, and routed Hunter's command. Hunter was so routed that he fled the Shenandoah and went all the way into West Virginia. That's quite a hike. Can you hit the next slide? Oh, next one, please. And we'll go back to the other one. So, with Early's command in the Shenandoah Valley, he now began moving on Washington, D.C. to threaten Washington, with the hoping it'll stampede Lee and draw troops from Grant's army away. The problem is that, of course, Halleck won't take charge of the situation. Grant's down by Petersburg. Here, the command structure is failing the Union. And so what Grant ultimately did was he detached a corps and sent it up there. He had additional reinforcements that were coming from Louisiana to go there. And he hoped that they would take care of Early. But ultimately what happened was Early reached the doorstep of Washington, D.C. Now imagine the outcome of the Civil War. Imagine the impact. If Early had gotten into Washington, even if he was there for only an hour, and burned a bunch of government buildings, while we would all rejoice today, probably. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be so flip. The bottom line is that it would have been a disaster for the Lincoln administration. You couldn't argue that the war was going well when the enemy had burned government buildings in Washington, D.C. that year. So Lincoln was really in a bad situation, and I think part of it was that Grant didn't want to give up whole, and Grant really didn't quite understand the gravity of the situation. Halleck was furious with Grant, Stanton was furious with Grant, and they tried to sabotage things that Grant was trying to do. Lincoln ultimately had to intervene, and the way he intervened was he warned Grant. Grant decided that he would come back on and personally take charge. But then the next day he thought maybe that's not a good idea. Why? Because if Grant left, the second in command was Benjamin Butler. That's a scary prospect. And secondly, he was fearful that that would create fear in the Northern public, that the campaign was failing, that Grant had to leave. And so he decided not to go, and of course, nothing really worked out very effectively. Ultimately, what happened was the administration really convinced him to take charge. Grant had proposed consolidating all the different commands into a single military department. And he proposed various individuals to command it. A guy named Franklin, who was in Grant's West Point class. But Franklin was too associated with McClellan and the Democratic Party. He had too much political baggage. They then recommended a guy named Christopher C. Augur, a household name. And Augur was considered unacceptable by Stanton. Then somebody floated the name of McClellan. You knew that didn't go. That went up like a lead balloon. And Grant suggested Meade, but Lincoln didn't want Meade. Why? Because Lincoln had lost faith with Meade when Meade failed to follow up the victory at Gettysburg and attack Lee's army when it was trapped north of the Potomac River. And so all these things became problems, and they couldn't get anyone to do anything. Finally, Grant appointed his cavalry commander, Philip Sheridan, to take charge and sent him up there. But Grant's instructions weren't very effective. He wrote, "Unless General Hunter is in the field personally, I want Sheridan put in command of all the troops in the field with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death." Of course, Halleck and Stanton obstructed Sheridan's appointment, and so ultimately Grant had to go up there. But he went up there after Lincoln sent a warning. Lincoln wrote that his plan, quote, "is exactly right as to how our forces should move." But then he warned Grant, quote, "Please look over the dispatches you may have received from here, even since you made that order, and discover, if you can, that there is any idea in the head of anyone here of putting our army south of the enemy or of following him to the death in any direction." Then Lincoln went on to counsel him with some pretty sage advice. "I repeat to you, it will neither be done nor attempted unless you watch it every day, an hour, and force it." So what he's saying is, we've got a bureaucracy here, and they're obstructing. And so what you're going to have to do is do it. So Grant goes up there, takes charge, gives the authority to Sheridan to oversee the operation. Sheridan gets his forces organized and then launches his attack. He's got 40,000 troops. The Confederates have about 15,000, and furthermore, he's got a really large cavalry force which fire repeating rifles. So they have firepower that is monumentally greater than anything the Confederates have. And then they start fighting. Battle of Winchester, and then Fisher's Hill, and then those were in September. Then in October, they fought another battle at Cedar Creek. And of course, the Confederacy was crushed. So the valley was now clear. Interestingly, what Grant wanted him to do, Sheridan to do, was then push up the valley southward, seize Stanton, and then march overland to Charlottesville, because you would destroy the rail connections and the Army of the Northern Virginia wouldn't be able to get supplies there. Sheridan demurred. Then in a classic after the war in his memoirs, he wrote, "Well, now I realize Grant was right. I should have done it." He could have shortened the war by about 4 months had he had it. Now what makes you think Sheridan has the brains to override Ulysses S. Grant? I can't figure that one out. But anyway, see, McClellan's not the only guy I'm critical of in this lecture. Can we go one slide forward, not backward? Oh, nope, the other direction. I'm sorry. The other backward. Yeah. This is one of the various fights around Petersburg, and they're numbered. But what you see Grant doing is Grant's fighting a siege. Lee knew that if the siege continued, ultimately the Union would win because they have overwhelming resources and firepower. So Grant's stretching the Confederate defenses more and more and more. By early January 1865, Lee realizes he's in dire straits. The troops are living on about 900 calories of food a day. They're on a slow starvation diet. To give you an idea how bad that is, they aren't receiving sufficient protein to sustain muscle mass, and they're so deficient in vitamins and minerals that their bodies are incapable of digesting the limited amounts of food that they're eating. So what you're seeing is a massive deterioration of Confederate troops in this campaign. Plus, they're badly overworked. Clothing is a big problem. They have to start recycling lead. They find lead balls and dig them out, and you get paid if you recycle lead, a penny per mini ball, and I think it was 10 cents for a solid shot, and they recycle them because they can't get lead into Richmond. The situation grows increasingly bad. As I said, by early 65, Jefferson Davis is alerted by Lee that he's not going to be able to hold out that much longer. In late November, or mid-November, of course, actually November 8th, Lincoln wins the election. It's not made public for another couple of days, but by about the 10th, it's public. Then on the 15th of November, Sherman begins his Great March, and those two combined result in massive desertion in the Confederate Army. By March of 1865, Lee's army is losing to desertion 100 men per day. That's an infantry brigade every 10 days. And it's because guys aren't being fed. The cause is lost. It's a really sad situation. Then in March of 1864, Grant sent a telegram to Lincoln. Now I'm so accustomed I accidentally say to my students, send them an email to come on down. Anyway, I didn't say that to you. He sent him a telegram, I would like very much to see you, and I think the rest would do you good. He wanted Lincoln to come down because he knew he was ready to launch the move that would kill Lee's army. And so, way over on the far left, lower left of that map, you see Five Forks. In April 1st, they fight the Battle of Five Forks. Sheridan's command wins, and with that, Lee's army is outflanked. Sheridan's going to be able to break the South Side Railroad, and Lee realizes he's going to have to evacuate Richmond. And so he begins the evacuation. The problem Lee has is, can you go to the next slide, please? No, Yep, that one. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the retreat to Appomattox. The problem Lee has is his troops are so sickly. As the medical director for the 3rd Corps wrote in his report in the end of February 1865, the Army doesn't have wholesale sickness, but there's a general weakness in the troops. And that's, of course, the product of the diet. And so guys who were truly devoted to the Confederate cause simply could not keep up on the march, and they were victims to the pursuit. Sheridan, of course, is exceedingly aggressive. This is where he had arrested a corps commander for moving to Five Forks for being tardy, and of course that sends a message to everybody that you better be on top of things. And so his pursuit was truly aggressive. Lee was heading westward and expecting to pick up supplies, but he failed to do so. When they got to Farmville, the supplies were not there. They then pushed westward towards Appomattox, and of course, Sheridan's commands were slicing up chunks of Lee's army as they were going. When they reached Appomattox Station on the 8th of April, Lee gave orders to his cavalry commanders to punch through. He knew that there were Union troops in front of him. He said, punch through if they're cavalry, but if they're infantry, pull back. And what had happened was some black troops had marched 24 consecutive hours and came around and positioned themselves in that area. So when the attack came, they didn't run into cavalry, they ran into infantry. And so by contacting those black soldiers, then Fitzhugh Lee pulled back, and that's when the negotiations took place between Lee and Grant. You all know, of course, they took place at the McLean House. If you ever get a chance to go to West Point, in their archives, they have the original handwritten surrender agreement by Grant in which he inserts comments, because Lee read it and he wanted the officers to be able to take their horses home with them because these guys were farmers and they needed their horses to go. If you're one of my students, you have to leave. We have a strict policy about that. It works, too. My wife has the same policy, but one time hers went off. That kind of undercuts your authority, don't you think? Anyway, they headed west, and they were boxed in at Appomattox Courthouse, and the surrender took place. Lee gave magnanimous terms. Grant gave magnanimous terms largely on the recommendation by Lincoln, but Lincoln didn't give him the terms per se. Grant wrote those out on the scene, which is truly extraordinary. And what he made clear was that these men were paroled and that they would not be hampered or harassed by the federal government so long as they abided by the terms of their parole and did not violate any state or local laws. So that gave them, in effect, and actually protected Lee from subsequent prosecution after the war as a traitor. So none of those soldiers could be prosecuted as a traitor. And when there was a rumor about a story going around about prosecuting Lee as a traitor, Grant came out publicly completely opposed to it, and even made it clear if Lincoln were alive, he would not tolerate this. So that's why Lee never went to jail for it. Let me give you a final assessment. What you have in Ulysses S. Grant is an individual who's got really good sound judgment. He's calm, he's thorough, he's careful, and he's effective. He's utilizing the overwhelming resources he's got, and he's making it work. Lee, of course, is pulling every trick out of the book he possibly has. He's always been really smart, really clever, but the problem is when you're confronting a guy like Grant who is dogged, who's unrelenting, you can't get an opportunity to utilize any of those tricks. And eventually the grind on the Army of Northern Virginia was so bad that the troops could not endure anymore. And so that's how Ulysses S. Grant was able to capture the Army of Northern Virginia. Thank you very much.